The classical Armenian system of deixis is famously complex. Like the hic, iste, and ille of Latin, Armenian utilizes a threefold deictic distinction. However, the Armenian system is richer, including not only pronouns, various adverbs, and pronominal adjectives, but also articles. Because Armenian lacks any gender distinction in its nominal and most of its pronominal inflections, its system of deixis heavily relies on physical and metaphorical distances, with often personal or emotional values attached to each. The deictic forms are based on the elements S, D, and N, signifying proximal, medial, and distal deixis, respectively. When comparing deictic systems of Greek, Latin, and Classical Armenian, the correspondences we would expect at the most basic level are the following. Greek hutos corresponds to Latin hic and Armenian s. Greek akanos corresponds to Latin ile and Armenian n. And Latin iste corresponds to Armenian d. These are listed in your handout 1. And we talked about it briefly with the previous talk as well. Two immediate observations from these correspondences point to 1, the lack of a medial deictic form in Greek, and 2, the apparent similarities between the Latin and Armenian systems. Therefore, we might hypothesize that 1, the appearance of the Armenian medial forms in a translation of a Greek original might raise issues of fidelity, and that 2, Latin and Armenian translations of the same Greek text might show similarities in their employment of deictic forms. In order to address these hypotheses, this paper narrows its focus to the usage of medial deixis in the Armenian translation of the Gospel of Matthew. Focusing on the medial forms allows us to examine not only the semantics of the Armenian forms themselves, but also the relationship to their Latin counterparts, as well as the nature of their employment, despite the non-existence of an equivalent in the Greek original. Key passages are analyzed in order to highlight the fact that the psychological and emotional values ascribed to medial deictic forms may raise issues of translation ideology and expectations. The medial deictic is strongly associated with the second person. It can express second person possession, something associated with the second person or adjustry of the speech act, or ascribe pejorative or negative value to the referent. In the interest of time, I won't be able to go through these individually, but examples are given in handout 2 through 4. And the numbers at the front of each passage indicates which chapter and verse number from Matthew. But if we turn now to handout 5, we see that these medial forms appear 30 times in the Armenian text, each translating Greek hutos. However, in the Latin text, only 5 out of these 30 are matched with the medial iste, and the rest show the proximal hic. Of the 28 instances of Latin iste, only one shows the Armenian distal deictic, and 22 show the proximal s deictic. It is remarkable that both the Latin and Armenian medial forms always translate a Greek proximal hutos and never the distal akanos. More importantly, however, the Latin and Armenian translations agreed on the use of a medial form only 5 out of the nearly 30 possible instances. If we zoom out and consider all deictic pronouns in Matthew, of the 246 collected Greek deictic forms, the Latin and Armenian translations use the same correspondent 168 times, which is a 68.3% rate. Of the 168 instances, 159 show the expected correspondent for each language. That is, there was a 3-way agreement across all 3 languages, which means that only 9 out of the 168 agreements occur where Latin and Armenian deviate from the Greek in the same way. Thus, we may be tempted to assume that in the 5 instances where Greek proximal deictic forms are translated with both Latin iste and Armenian d, Latin and Armenian translators are in agreement on what relationship within the context should be emphasized with the medial deictic form. However, because of the relative paucity of instances where Latin and Armenian agree in their deviations, we must attribute these agreements to simple coincidence. Although it is unfortunate that any relationship between the Latin and Armenian translations in this context is unlikely, the few deviations do offer a window into the syntax and translation techniques of the individual languages. Of the different types of divergences throughout Matthew, the insertion of medial deixis is the most difficult. On the one hand, we may ascribe the Armenian and Latin use of medial deixis to linguistic idiom and permit its insertion. To take it one step further, to forbid the use of iste or d forms on the grounds that there is no Greek equivalent would cause the forms to disappear entirely from any literal translation of a Greek text and render the study useless. One might say that the insertion of medial deixis in the two languages is permissible. They might argue that the translators are simply observing the idioms and style of their own language, and that no new meaning is produced as a result. And they might further assert that the reference to the second person of the speech act or to a negatively perceived referent is implicit, and that the translators were simply expressing what was inexpressible but implied in the Greek. The first issue with this is that there is rarely anything implied in the Greek. If there were a clear implication in the Greek text, we would expect the Armenian and Latin versions to agree on when and where they insert the medial deixis. For example, this is handout 6. In 2336, the Latin translator focused on the second person referent of the pronoun and used istam for upon this generation of yours. But evidently the Armenian translator did not pick up on the relationship, evidenced by his retention of the proximal deictic in Aski's Aisorik. But as discussed above, it is rare for the Latin and Armenian versions to agree in their use of medial deixis. Clearly, the translator's decisions are not based on anything indicated in the Greek, but on non-regularized personal perceptions of the relationships described in the text. The second issue is that there are instances where the inserted medial form does in fact add significant meaning to the text, particularly in the Armenian version. One classic example of this occurs at 1618. This is handout 7. The subtle wordplay with Peter's name and the rock in the original Greek famously becomes the basis for the Roman Catholic tradition that St. Peter's Basilica was built over his burial site. In the Armenian version, however, because the word rock or vem does not sound like Peter's name, the pun cannot be replicated. Instead, the Armenian uses vem and creates wordplay with the second person medial deictic adjective. Jesus tells his disciple that you are a rock, douas vem, as opposed to Greek and Latin, you are Peter. By calling Peter a rock, Jesus makes very explicit the connection between the two clauses. The Armenian says, you're a rock, and on this rock, namely you, the rock, I'll build my church. The connection is much weaker in Greek and Latin. You're Peter, and on this rock, I'll build my church. The changes made in Armenian, although the text remains very nearly lexically identical to the Greek, is able to add exegetically significant meaning that was only weakly implied in the Greek. The overwhelming pejorative values of D-Dex is pervasive throughout Jesus' trial, condemnation, and crucifixion, however, I would argue are not at all implied in the Greek text. In 2741 through 49, Armenian uses D-Dexis 6 times. 3 of them correspond with Greek anaphoric autos, 1 with proximal hutos, and twice with no deictic form in Greek. And this is in handout 8. The derogatory and negative connotations of this passage begin with the verb jalein, they mocked, and are first picked up by the enclitic D with I chached from that cross. Greek has no deictic marker with the prepositional phrase apotustaru. So this is the first major Armenian innovation of the passage, where pejorative value is ascribed to not only Jesus, but to his cross as well. The mockery and ridicule are manifestly overt. An English translation that incorporates some of the emotional coloring provided by the Armenian might be something like, he can't even save himself. If he really is the king of Israel, shouldn't he be able to come down from the damned cross? If he did, we'd believe the guy. Each subsequent reference to Jesus, excluding those of the narrative, is also made with a pejorative form in D. Apart from the verb of mockery in the participle empaisdontes, however, there is no indication of any negative connotations in the Greek, and even in Latin, the pejorative iste is used only once in verse 47. It is true that some of the D forms with Jesus are governed by deictic consistency and may therefore be considered coincidental. Due to the time, I'm unable to talk about the principle of deictic consistency, but I included some examples in handout 9 below, and I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A. However, the second D pronoun in verse 42, as well as the enclitic with the cross, are most certainly Armenian embellishments that attach pejorative value to Jesus. The use of the pronoun da in verses 47 and 49 also reveals the deliberate choice of the Armenian translator to insert disparagement, given that they appear in new discourse fragments that are not bound by deictic consistency. What is remarkable is that Armenian is able to add such a blatant layer of ridicule and scorn while still adhering to the vocabulary and word order of the Greek. Therefore, the Armenian version is extraordinary in its ability to translate literally while simultaneously functioning as a subtle commentary on the text. This all must answer to the rebuttal, however, that although there is no suggestion of a negative context at Jesus' crucifixion or a second-person reference in the Petros passage in the Greek syntax, one could certainly argue that it is implied in the Greek text overall. In modern translation theory, this is referred to as simply explication and is considered an acceptable feature of translation. The Armenian language allows the translator to assess and express aspects of the narrative where the Greek is unable to do so, and the translation is therefore based on the interpreter's decision of how best to render the text as a whole. From this standpoint, one could easily argue that, for example, the Greek verb of mockery in 2741 and the larger context of Jesus' condemnation and crucifixion serve to clearly indicate the negative connotations of the passage, and that the Armenian rendering is in fact no different from the original. However, the Latin language offers the same option to the translator, and yet St. Jerome rarely makes the same choices as the Armenian translator. This seems to suggest that even if the translators are interpreting with an eye to the relational values that Greek is unable to express, the urge to explicate them is felt on an individual basis with no concrete or tangible foundation in the Greek text. It is an unavoidable fact that the linguistic means at one's disposal will govern the nature and contents of one's translation. The use of different pronouns makes a difference not only on a lexical level, but on a psychological level as well. Given the three-way system in Armenian, which differs from the two-way system in Greek, the translator had available the stylistic option of adding psychological meaning. We have found that the Armenian translation at times provides extra context or commentary that goes beyond what is explicitly or implicitly indicated in the Greek. At the same time, however, it also remains extremely literal. As Metzger writes, the differences are quite minimal and very definite. If they are kept in mind, the model followed by the translator can be reconstructed. For the same care which he took in rendering precisely the nuances of an expression prevented him from ignoring details and also led him to model his sentence structure on that of his exemplar whenever possible. This is what makes the Armenian version so valuable for the exegete and what makes it possible to identify clearly the nature of his exemplar. The purpose of this study was to investigate the systems of Deixis in Armenian with the hope that the translation of the Greek deictic forms may reveal something about the techniques of the translator. We have found that the Armenian version, often called the Queen of the Versions, has the extraordinary ability to function occasionally as a commentary while remaining faithfully literal. Thank you.